Welcome to our second episode of the webinar series, Ways Public in Public Policy. Today's webinar is co-hosted with International Institute of Migration and Development. Today we have extraordinary lineup of distinguished speakers and experts who will shed light on various aspects of exploring the interplay between climate change and migration through an intersectional lens. As climate change fuels more frequent, intense, and extended weather events, it would put the achievement of SDG at significant risk. Individuals, families, and communities will be forced to migrate to prevent or reduce harm and find safety. Over 3 million people were displaced in 2021 alone in India, making it the fourth worst hit country due to climate induced migration. Women and marginalized groups, in particular, are greatly affected due to the limited means and assets to cope with natural hazards or disasters. Today's webinar will discuss their unique challenges and strategies to empower them. Furthermore, it will foster a cross-border perspective by drawing lessons from international experiences, informing India's system and policies. The webinar will be for an hour due to unavoidable commitments by our panel members. There will also be a short survey at the end of the webinar. Please fill it out and let us know your thoughts and suggestions about the topic and future webinars you would like us to see. I now welcome my colleagues at PDAC and the moderator for today's session, Dr. Ekta Bakshi and Ms. Nirali Baksha, who lead the migration working area at PDAC. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mayank, for this lovely introduction and for setting the tone for today's webinar. And I am extremely humbled to be sitting virtually, of course, alongside such eminent panelists. And it's almost, I'm nervous and excited at the same time. So without wasting any more time, I will just introduce our eminent panelists. Professor Iruday Rajan is the chairman of the International Institute of Migration and Development in India and the chair of the Nomad Thematic Working Group on Internal Migration and Urbanization, World Bank. Earlier, he was a professor and chair of the Research Unit on Internal Migration funded by the erstwhile Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs, Government of India. This was from 2006 to 2016 at CDS. Dr. Rajan is the founding editor-in-chief of Migration and Development and two other Routledge series, India Migration Report and South Asia Migration Report. Ms. Ritu Bhardwaj is the team lead and principal researcher on climate change at the International Institute of Environment and Development. With more than 18 years of senior policy development, research, and management experience in government, funding agencies, and international NGOs, Ritu has worked extensively on social protection, climate resilience, including areas such as policy planning and finance, forest and watershed management, resource conservation, water and energy efficiency, renewables, and circular economy. And she's also worked on livelihood and gender issues. Mr. Libby Johnson is the executive director of Gram Vikas. He has led large-scale impactful poverty alleviation efforts with nonprofits, multilateral organizations, and government, and has 25 years and more experience in social development work. His multi-sectoral experience spans water, sanitation, livelihoods, disaster management, and community institutions. In 2019-2020, he served as a member of the National Task Force for Jal Jeevan Mission, Ministry of Jal Shakti, Government of India. And with this introduction, I once again, a very warm welcome to all our panelists. And now I invite Nirali, my co-discussant in this session, to formally inaugurate the session by asking some of the very pertinent questions that we have been itching to ask. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ekta. I again thank all of our panelists for joining us on a busy weekday, Tuesday afternoon to delve deeper into a conversation that we have been waiting to have with everyone. Without wasting any more time, I would like to direct my first question to Dr. Rajan, here. Sir, I'd like to ask you that as we have seen that the COVID-19 crisis in 2020 and over the years also post-2020, the recovery from COVID-19 crisis has also made us take notice of the magnitude of insecure internal migration that happens in India and the challenges and vulnerabilities associated with it. However, we are yet to understand how climate change has contributed to the drivers and impacts of such insecure migration. How do we then begin to understand, also isolate and measure the impact of climate change on migration? Because as we understand that given migration is not monocausal in nature, and neither are the challenges faced by migrants upon migration. So what are your thoughts on this, sir?
Thank you very much for the, for this particular webinar, because climate change is the one we started looking at it for a few years right now. And let me start with giving a broad understanding of this, what we call them the socio-economic and psychological, issues faced by the migrants, particularly the migrants related to marginalized groups during the climate change. Now, for example, we know even very little about the psychological challenges posed by migrants. For example, in the context of, during COVID or pre-COVID or after COVID, there are a lot of suicides are happening among the returned migrants. I don't think we are talking about that returned migrant suicide. I think it's something one should look at it carefully. And also the accidents, the breadwinner, for example, we used to talk about every day, every week there should be 4 dead bodies coming from Qatar to Nepal. They were talking earlier. Now I don't know how many dead bodies are going between states. In the construction site accident from this state, somebody died. That state, somebody died. Most of the accident deaths are mostly migrants. Right? So, so we are not even understanding the general profile of the migrants. So in that, you have to go to particularly on the, the marginalized groups. I think that is something we have to really look at it. And one thing which we are noticing, I think this is something people think climate change means they think only floods. It's not just floods. It's beyond, even no rain is a climate change. More rain is a climate change. Like no rain, climate change. There are agricultural crisis because of the water scarcity, drinking water issues, and nothing to grow in certain areas, people are leaving. So I think we are not able to capture exactly what is happening on that, because we don't have, which I always argue, we don't have any real database. I think database issues are still, India is a big, I think something which we have to work hard to generate reasonable data to talk about climate change and migration impact. But what we noticed now, we were doing a large-scale survey in both Jharkhand and Orissa. We have completed with the 25,000 households in both states. I think something coming up very clearly in, for example, in Orissa, people go to the minority groups and the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes and offer them what is called this one-time payment, which we were shocked to hear in certain areas. In Orissa, for example, I myself visited certain areas. So I think this one-time payment, which is slavery during change, or the ages, because once you is a poor village person, I think you are almost buying the person, taking to another state. He may come, he may not come. Maybe they say there was an accident, dead body comes, give them another 50,000 rupees, matter ends there. But there is nobody to talk for them. They are vulnerable, unskilled, poor, illiterate. I think they have a lot of disabilities. So I think we need to look at more on that. And also, for example, even the wages, even the poor people, there is no wages. For example, if you go to many hotels, even in Kerala, which I see, a lot of people from other states are coming and working. I don't think there is no working time, because I see somebody in the morning in the hotel at 6:30 for a coffee. I go nights the same hotel. I see the same people standing there. You see, imagine the health hazard. Somebody is walking in the hotel, cleaning or providing food from morning 6 to night 9. Can you imagine how long he can work? So maybe the age of 40, they all might die even. We should look at it. How quickly these people die. They look very old. When I go to certain villages in Tamil Nadu, people look old when they are 45. I think that itself indicates that, like the clothes you use every day. And then if you are using the same clothes for several days and washing clothing, then, completely, I think people are really, really distressed. I think we should look at it. and add climate change to that, I think it looks like a highly vulnerable. I'll stop here because let us get more views on that. Yeah, for this question.
Thank you, Professor Rajan, for those very deep insights. And I think there's a lot that comes across from what you just told us, that I mean, this last part of your conversation was about people from distressed, people from marginalized backgrounds and how that adds to their distress. So moving on to Ritu, I would just take up the questions from there that, it's been argued that climate change and climate change related migration often sort of perpetuates and reinforces existing inequalities. So given your such vast experience, could you tell us a little more and take us through how climate change related displacement and migration sort of shapes and reshapes existing inequalities, how it perpetuates, and also how do we sort of try to then reimagine climate justice in such a context through an intersectional way, and also climate justice for people who move and who do not move, or who move for a certain periods, because these, I believe, are also connected to existing inequalities. So, yeah.
Thank you for that question. And in fact, thanks to Professor Rajan also, because, you presented that from a perspective which I was, I would have touched, but you have presented that in such a in such a personalized way, which really sets the tone for what I wanted to say. So what we really should understand that climate change is not occurring in isolation. It is occurring on top of all the historical development deficits that we had, and it's not just about India. In most of the other countries, India is still developing. It's still, people talk about India being an emerging economy, but just talk about any of these developed countries or small island development states, which don't even have the kind of resources that is needed to provide that safety net. And if we just talk about India, just look at the predisposing factors that we have. Predisposing factors are, there is gender marginalization, there are excluded groups, there are tribal communities which are still primitive tribal group. You've now rechristened them as particularly vulnerable tribal groups. And you have to understand there are development deficits in the form of poor awareness about entitlement, poor representation in many decision-making bodies. So these are already pre-existing, the way we define them as predisposing factors. And then climate is acting as a precipitating factors on all these predisposing factors. So what it does is, people who are already vulnerable, people who are already marginalized, people who don't sit in the decision-making body, and I'm not talking about the top level, I'm talking about the village level, where decisions about NGNREG's job cards happens, decision about access to PDS subsidy happens, decisions about how the cyclone shelters would be designed, all of that where women or the marginalized groups are not represented, which means that the safety net that typically could have been made available to them, that's not available to them in the same way as others. And probably they don't have the skills, they're not educated enough to look for alternate livelihoods. So, in our own research, we and again, Professor Rajan, we also looked at the same two locations, one Palamu in Jharkhand, another one was Kendrapada in Odisha. And it's quite, for us, it was, I myself, I'm from Bihar, so where migration is been there as part of the livelihood basket for everybody for centuries, I would say. It's been there. So migration is never considered as a bad option, but when it becomes a distress migration, then it becomes a bad option. And what we saw when we were doing this link between climate migration and the vulnerability it creates to, like, in many ways, when you say forced labor, bonded labor, exploitative labor, all of that qualifies an international definition of modern slavery. So we were looking into, and also trafficking. And when we compared these two locations, we saw that in Palamu, the level of the percentage of migrants who are actually becoming victims of modern slavery or trafficking was 42% compared to 16% in Kendrapada. Now, 16% is also quite high a number, but when you compare that with 42%, close to 3 times higher. And then we started exploring the reasons behind it. One, of course, in Palamu, it's drought affected, and Kendrapada is flood and cyclone affected. When it's flood and cyclone, there's a massive media coverage. Everybody goes there with humanitarian assistance. In Palamu, it's like a slow poison, drought, nobody covers, drought doesn't even get declared. So people are left to fend for themselves. But you also have to understand in Palamu is historical marginalization. So like even going to that area where we were conducting, then because when the data started coming in, I thought that the data was wrong. And I thought they were not doing the survey in the proper manner. So just reaching that field was 4 hours. No one government official goes there. There is, and the reason for that was lack of, even though MGNREGS is there, most of them, they don't have access to PDS job cards. People don't have access to 2 square meals a day, even though in India we have Food Security Act. And like when we were doing that regression analysis as to what pushes communities to undertake distress migration, child trafficking was so common in PVTG group, and people, they knew, because we went and asked them as to, you know what's going to happen to your child, and they said, if I don't send my one child, my rest of the child will go hungry. So you have to understand it from that context. So therefore you need, and again, a very startling factor was, in terms of our regression analysis, we saw that marginalization, social marginalization, caste-based marginalization increases the odds of distress migration by 338%. And if you compare that with Kendrapada, there were many things which were in favor of Kendrapada, because there the education levels were high, the people were mostly from the dominant caste. Kendrapada once used to be a very prosperous area. Again, a classic example of how climate can take a place from being prosperous, agriculturally prosperous, to a non-prosperous area. So what do you really need? So you have a predisposing factors, which is development deficits and marginalization. You have precipitating factor in the form of climate change, but you also need a protective factor. And that protective factor needs to, especially for the migrants, and it is true for both the people who are not able to move, which we typically call them as trapped population, as those who are able to move. And also, we need to, for example, when we went to Palamu, I'll just quickly mention this fact as well. When we went to Palamu, of course, a lot of them, and similar to what Professor Rajan was saying, you know, they said, there was one returning migrant sitting there, and he said, when we go out, sometimes we come back, sometimes our dead bodies. But they still pursue that because they have no other option. And young girls, as young as 12, 13, 14, and I have nieces and nephew of that age, and I know how young and innocent they are. Like 3 girls, you know, I counted, there were 16 brick kilns in that area. The land there is so prosperous, there is water scarcity. Still, can you imagine, there's 16 brick kilns. And what they do, all these young girls who are not migrating, 3 girls, they form a group, and they make those green bricks from the mud. They work for 3 days, and then they are able to produce 1,000 bricks. And like, if you assess what their daily wage would come to around 150, 200 per day, which is less than MGNREGS. So I asked them, why don't you go and work there? And they say, you know, yeah, some machines se kaam hota hai. So the thing is, you know, some of these programs are well-intentioned, well-designed, but they don't really reach the people who it should really reach to. So you also asked the question as to what really needs to be done. What really needs to be done is support before migration. And you have to understand that many of these migrants or these people there, they have been engaged in traditionally natural resource-based livelihood, so agriculture, forest-based livelihoods. But if you really want to develop them for future markets where you know that more of drought, more of cyclone, more of flood would happen, and they will have to undertake migration, can we not prepare them beforehand in terms of building their skills, providing them entitlements, and also provide them safety net? If they have livelihood safety through MGNREGS, if they have food safety through PDS access, if they have water safety, that's the safety net you need to create so that people don't have to undertake migration in distress. It is opportunistic, it is more informed. Then people need support during migration, because there are so many instances where we saw that SIM cards were taken away, job cards were taken away, ID cards were taken away. So can we provide them protection during migration? And after migration, of course, we have to look at, because most of these workers end up in informal labor market. So can we not look at social protection and informal labor market in a conjoined way rather than those two things working in silos? So how do we link them together, but also make some of the social protection provisions more portable so that these people are not, them or their families who migrate with them, they get covered through health coverage, through, of course, India has been one of the pioneering countries where one nation, one ration card has been done. But there are some operational issues as well. So how can we bring about that portability in more of social protection programs? So I'll stop there. Probably I spoke more than I should have.
No, thank you so much, Ritu, for delving deeper into the myriad of factors that are actually operational at the ground level that leads to such a phenomenon. And as we are trying to delve deeper into it, as you rightly pointed out, there are already historical and developmental deficits, which has led to some predisposing factors, and them, along with the intersectional characteristics that we have in our rural economy, various socio-cultural groups, socio-economic groups, socio-political groups, the needs of SCs, STs, PVTGs, the needs of women, the needs of adult population that is on a rise in India. We have achieved a really high section of population where we have a lot of adult workforce who are ready to join the workforce and take up employment opportunities. So, and you rightly pointed out that we might need different kinds of protective factors to cater to these issues. And some of them are definitely well-intentioned, but sometimes not well-designed, because they might not be able to take into account all the specific needs of all these different groups that we have in our rural economy. With this, I would move on to Libby, sir, and I would like to ask him and try to delve deeper into this, as Ritu also mentioned opportunistic migration as the key livelihood strategy. So we have Libby, sir, with us here. So with your experience in poverty alleviation and migrant community studies, could you share more insights into the key factors that differentiate secure and insecure forms of migration, or that differentiate distress migration from aspirational or opportunistic migration? And how does, as Ritu also said, climate change acts as a precipitating factor. So how does climate change in this scenario complicates the situation much more? And how can we then disaggregate such impacts across various socio-political and economic groups?
Thank you, Nirali. What I speak would be based on experience of working in the southern and western parts of Odisha. So I'm speaking from a very specific part of the country. About three quarters of the population in these areas belong to scheduled communities, scheduled tribes, or scheduled castes. Eastern Ghats region, so high slopes, rainfall is fairly good in many parts, but there are also parts of West Odisha which are semi-arid kind. So that's the context in which I would like to, what we've learned about how do we differentiate between distress and not distress migration, aspirational or not aspirational migration. I think there are three key points that I would like to delineate. The first question is, who is migrating? In the case of distress migration, what we often find is whole families actually move away. And this is particularly in the semi-arid parts where the whole family has to move out. And it is mostly the landless, the most marginal landholders who are forced to migrate out of distress. And this, if you look at the history over the last 40 years, the number of people, the proportion of people migrating, landowning people migrating has increased. And that's clearly a indicator of how much agrarian distress has come into place. It's delayed monsoons, unstable, inconsistent rainfall that is actually leading to regular history of crop losses that make people, people lose confidence in farming as even sufficient for what would be two, 3 months of grain. That's what otherwise they would have farmed for. So that would be those are the kind of people who would really go into distress migration. Who are the people who go for, who look at opportunistic or aspirational migration? It's mostly the younger people. And in the sample that we have, 90% are individual men, that they go individually. Even when women go, the young girls in the apparel industry or in the fish processing, seafood processing industry, they travel on their own. And you find that a lot of them are actually from the rural middle class. I'm not saying that people from the poorer sections don't migrate, but it's the younger people from families who have started moving away from agriculture. So they're not necessarily landless. They have some options to fall back at home. They are the ones who are going away, going out of the state, looking for better incomes. So this is one, who is migrating. The second question I would ask is, who is the intermediary? Who is the decision supporting intermediary? And across the board, you'll find that distress migration always has an advance-based contracting, which Professor Rajan also mentioned about the one-time payments. There's a certain amount of forced nature. Ritu mentioned about various, the whole spectrum of bonded to forced to kind of modern slavery kind of things. So you find that distress migration is most often I have not myself seen any distress migration where a person chooses to go on his or her own. There has to be an intermediary involved. The only exception in this case is in some parts of Nuapada and Kalahandi, where they migrate to places like Raipur and Bilaspur to be seasonal rickshaw pullers and urban informal workers, but that's a very small number. And that is more of a social network kind of thing. And almost the entire opportunistic migration that we see is social network based. So I have somebody who I know in Kerala or in Telangana or in Hyderabad, so I go after that person. And I have not seen much of opportunistic migration, which is contractor based, where a contractor comes and pays an advance or hires. Once they go to the destination, they might work with a contractor. That's a different matter, but that's a labor supplier at the destination. And such contractors seldom come to the source base. The third question is, how much control does a person have over where to go and what work to do? And in the case of distress migration, I would say it's zero, because the contractor decides when to go, how to go, where to go, what work to do. What we found interestingly is in the opportunistic migration case, there are three factors that influence this decision of where to go, when to go, how long to go for. One is, of course, the ability to pay for travel. Do I have enough liquid cash for me to buy the ticket in the train or in the bus? Do I have enough money with me to go somewhere and wait for a good job rather than get into a bad job in whatever ways? The third is, of course, the livelihood season at home. So am I needed at home to supplement the additional labor that is required either during sowing or harvesting, etc.? So opportunistic migration is a way more complex decision than distress migration, which is anyway, distress means it's straightforward, you have to go. So I would use these three factors as primarily, there'll be many more, but these three would be for me primary indicators of how to differentiate whether that migration is out of distress, forced, or it is out of choice. I'll stop there. Thank you.
That actually was the division between who is migrating, through which channels, and then does one have enough to, choose between what kind of job, which kind of destination. So that sort of sets probably the tone for understanding how do we understand what impact climate has on certain kinds of migration. And we are, of course, we notice this in the Jharkhand Migration Survey, that often the range of choices available, which I probably gather is what we are talking about, gets restricted and narrowed down. So with that, I would like to come to Professor Rajan once again. And this is something that both Nirali and I have been trying to understand for a while, and of course others at the organization, that how do we then sort of try to map trends, collect data? I understand that, like Nirali was saying, that it is, of course, not monocausal, it is multi-causal. But Professor Rajan, you have authored the India Migration Report. So we just want to understand if, first of all, what kinds of trends, can there be any kind of trends that can be located in terms of climate migration? Can there be, can these trends be socially disaggregated by social groups and socio-political groups so that we get some sense? And then what are the further scope of sort of developing and strengthening these matrices where we have some idea of, because we all, I know, Professor Rajan, that you've mentioned that there is no data, but there is so much need to also produce that data to make an impact. How do we go about doing that? And what are some of the ways we can learn from the India Migration Report?
No, I think I would like to start with, because as I heard from both Ridu and Libby, I think there is a big labor mafia, I call them. I think there is a big mafia is working. We used to call land mafia. Now I think land has gone now. There's no land now. The labor mafia, which is exploiting at the core, including not paying salaries for many of the people I know. Right now, even in Kerala, I don't think they are getting the wages what the Keralites gets. They'll be getting less than what the Keralites gets, and they are not paid. I think this is something we should look at it when you discuss on the climate change and internal migrant. Let me come back to the India Migration Report. India Migration Report is just a series I started several years back to just put the people. Migration is important. I think that's why I always want to thank COVID-19. Because COVID-19 brought migration to the forefront. Otherwise, it's not that problem was not there. It opened our eyes. It exposed us how bad we are. I think it exposed ourselves during COVID-19, how bad we manage migration. It is not like it was not there. We know they are all there. But it was openly, like it's open, so I think COVID, I think like that we might need something more, because I remember when we started working on, the IMR, I have not put up a theme still on climate change and migration. Of course, I brought out a book sometime back, because when we had a big seminar with 150 participants in 10 years back, there are only 3 people wrote a paper for climate change in India. And then we were thinking to edit a book. I could not find even 10 authors who are working on climate change. In the sense, there may be people working, but when I want to really get them to put in the book, I have to wait 3 years. Myself and Professor Bhagat in IIPs were waiting for almost 3 to 4 years to bring out this book called Climate Change, Vulnerability and Migration. That is the status of research on migration, I can say. So, and then recently, a few weeks back, we are having a seminar in Northumbria University in UK, and where I was, part of the team to prepare a larger proposal on climate change in South Asia. They asked me to look at the review of literature in South Asia. I would find very unfortunate, I would say, we can imagine only 10 good studies, which I can take and talk to people for India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. I have not looked at Nepal and other things. So I think there's still very serious research on climate change. I think like a larger studies looking at the coastal belt. We only talk about tsunami. We talk some studies. Kerala floods. Kerala flood will come every 100 years, so we cannot wait for that. We have to look at it. So I think that is something we should look at it. This is very important. And the second point I want to make, for example, Kerala had flood in 2018, and we had a big survey before the COVID. So we went to certain households who were part of our original sample, like a panel data. We went them in 2000, probably in 20, prior to the COVID and after the floods. And there was loss of livelihoods, loss of land, which was used for the agriculture. It became completely because of the, and I am not sure still they have recovered from that. We want to do a panel study this year. See that are they back to normal after 5 years where the flood was affected so much in Kerala? I'm sorry, I don't think they are back to the normal not pre-COVID, pre-floods. I think those type of studies, I think it is, we should look at it. So I think because of this seminar, maybe, the current IMR is on student migration, the theme of the current IMR, because that is a hot topic. And the next one will be Indians in Canada, which is also in the press now. Suddenly, Canada suddenly became very famous now. So I told the publisher, I don't know, suddenly, I start working something, then become very famous. Now, India, Canada is, everybody calling me how many Indians are in Canada. I said, wait, the book is not out. It will take maybe another few months. So maybe 2025, IMR 2023-24 is already in the press. 25, maybe I'll think of a climate change and migration as a theme for the IMR. That will be the 16th number, in the sense. So I think, maybe at the time, I think that we have enough people to write on climate change and migration. I will stop there. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for also stressing upon the fact that we need more and more researchers and more ideas and research understanding the complex interplay of climate change and migration. With this, with the complexities, I again go back to Ritu, and given her work in also early warning systems and various other interventions and protective factors that Ritu was talking about, I would like to now direct some attention towards some of the initiatives or interventions that can prove to be effective in addressing the intersectional realities brought about by climate change and climate change induced migration, both at the source locations and at the destination locations. Also, when we're talking about marginalized groups, then I'd like to just add another complexity, which is basically those who move and those who do not move. And we know what implications this has on women specifically. And another complexity, if I may just add to this, is basically what kind of interventions can help address the challenges associated with rapid and slow onset disasters. We have talked about tsunami, we have talked about floods, we have talked about agrarian crisis, we have talked about increasing salinity, alkalinity of soil, we have talked about loss of other livelihoods, natural resource-based livelihoods, loss of NTFPs. So yeah, I mean, what could be some of the interventions that we can learn from, and also start thinking in that direction to slowly start better understanding the phenomenon.
Thanks. And I always love to talk about that more than the problem itself. See, I agree with Professor Rajan that, there was a lot of debate earlier where, there was kind of debate within and outside the research community as to whether climate is really driving migration. I think we have settled that debate now because, there is a growing recognition that climate is driving migration, and there's no dearth of evidence around it. Within the UNFCCC mechanism in itself, the WIM has set up a task force on displacement, which means that they have started recognizing. IPCC latest report for the first time agrees that the biggest human impact of climate change could be human displacement. There's a couple of other, World Bank's groundswell report and so on. Now, we really need to now move into solution space. And there's one point where I still go into panel discussion, and I get at loggerheads with a lot of these panelists from IOM and other prominent organizations, where there is still, kind of, and there is political economy around that, is they accept that there is internal displacement, but they don't accept there's a cross-border migration. And we very well know that it is happening. And, we have ample evidence. We are ourselves doing research in 12 geographies, how within Africa, people are moving using Egypt, and then all of those people land up in Middle East, same Bangladesh, Nepal moves into India, from here they move into Middle East. So what happens if you don't recognize that climate is driving migration, not just internal, but cross-border? Lack of not acknowledging that and leads to other cascading impacts in the form of modern slavery, trafficking, and so on, which means you're allowing these illegal middlemen to flourish and work under because, like even when we were producing our paper, we were told not to use the word modern slavery because, and it's not just with India, it's also with Bangladesh. We are currently doing a research there where they don't like to accept the word modern slavery. Now we don't accept, so, we remove the word modern slavery because we do want policymakers to take note of it. And I would commend India's planning, Niti Aayog. For the first time, they recognize that there is human rights issues of migrant workers. So that's a very good starting point. Now, you talked about early warning system. For us, you would see India has really done a very good work in terms of flood and cyclone early warning system. At least they take people to safety. People don't die. Those number of lives, if you compare with earlier super cyclones, not so many people are dying. But where we still lack is lack of early warning system for slow onset events like drought. And again, there is political economy around that. So, so we worked with Ministry of Rural Development to develop drought early warning system because, like, not many people would know that within MGNREGS, there is 100 days of guaranteed wage employment provided to every rural household. But if there is a drought, or a cyclone or a flood, and like a severe natural calamity, additional 50 days of employment is provided. So when we went and found out in our area, we saw that the drought gets declared almost 3 to 4 months after its occurrence. And by then, people already undertake distress migration. By the time they come back, the financial year is towards the end, so they'll, the entitlement is not there. And when we raised this point with MORD, they said, nobody, there's no claimant of that additional 50 days. It's not. But the problem is, it's not the problem of claiming, it's the problem of not declaring it in time. So that's why we came up with this drought early warning system, so that anticipatory planning. If you know that a drought of a severe category is about to hit an area, why don't you do an anticipatory planning for those social protection covers? So at least people don't migrate in distress. They know that livelihood safety would be there, but of course there are other issues around, the wage rate are so low, like it's even lower than the agricultural minimum wage rate. So how do you, but nonetheless, it's still a good safety net, and not many other countries have it. So what we really need is a proper rights-based, comprehensive and portable social protection. I would also like to highlight the really good work that one of our partner organization, FIA Foundation, is doing in Jharkhand. So they have set up this migration helpline. And Professor Rajan was saying, Libby was also mentioning that, the point is many of these workers, when they get employed in areas which are extremely hazardous, extremely dangerous, and then they don't have their own control over what work they can undertake, what work they cannot undertake, that's when you understand it's forced labor, exploitative labor. And most of these work, so what this migration helpline does, they have set up extensive network of NGOs, not just within Jharkhand, but outside the state as well. So anyone, and they have really popularized this helpline. So they, on an average, they receive a lot of calls, and they make it a point to go and rescue these people, because this helpline is regulated out of CM's office. So the administration in other states, they immediately respond to their call, or when they reach out to them that such and such workers are trapped here and they need to be rescued. And again, I'll also want to highlight this initiative by Kerala government, where I think they have, I'm not directly involved, but I have read about it, where they have set up these migrant hostels, which I think at least it's an attempt to recognize that migrants are part of the economy in the cities, in urban locations. So can we not provide them decent places? Because many of these migrants are temporary in nature. You go in a city, you go and check into a hotel, but do migrants have that? So they are pushed to stay in informal locations, where with poor hygiene, poor sanitation and other facilities. So, so you really need to look at some of these factors from that perspective, and in the sense of creating that safety net around that. So, yeah, and I'll just stop there, because I think I'm not leaving enough time for other panelists to come in.
Thank you so much, Ritu. Actually, this is something that we observed during the Jharkhand migration survey, exactly that how social security nets and often it's my understanding, and I'm still learning, that often we tend to put things in silos. So climate migration becomes there's a narrow approach to sort of responding to what we understand the effects of climate change are. But the climate-induced migration actually is such a broad gamut. And of course, we have been working towards making migration secure, which is how we arrived at this. And we sort of understood, and we're still understanding and unraveling the complexities of this, and how to make migration secure is a larger question of convergence, of making multiple cogs in the wheel work together. So that is what actually I would want to ask Libby, given that you've been working on this for such a long time, what are some of the best practices, some of the best ways in which we can imagine like a more holistic framework for working around climate-induced migration and making migration more secure?
I don't think we can do much focusing on migration itself. or the root causes, which is climate change. That's a different matter altogether. But if we accept that migration is definitely one of the coping mechanisms that climate affected communities resort to, then I think interventions around safety and dignity have to be at 3 levels: one at the migrant worker himself or herself, the family that stays behind, and the community from which the workers come. What does a worker need? Worker needs information about travel, support for that, advisory on that, needs a bank account through which she or he can transact remittances easily. The bank account obviously needs to have a branch at home, and which is what many of the rural remote areas in central India don't have. Then that's the reason why migrant workers don't transact through bank accounts, because they have access to a bank account in the workplace, but the family back home is unable to withdraw cash from the bank account when they need it. So that's another area. A whole range of support systems at the destination, which includes healthcare, which includes legal support, support for grievance redressal, some of which was referred to earlier also in the call. What we found, we thought would be the most advantageous, but the least accepted is information about jobs. And for some reason, young people who migrate out of Odisha seem to know what they want to. I mean, trying to mediate for jobs has not really worked for us. On the household side, I mean, there's a need for a huge social and emotional support mechanism, because mothers who stay behind, younger wives who stay behind, older wives who stay behind, and children, 4 different categories of dependents who stay behind have different kinds of social and emotional needs. And there has to be ways in which this can be done. Self-help groups of women are one way. Better functioning Anganwadis and better functioning primary schools are a way to address this. So there are ways that these things have to happen. Of course, access to social protection, because the moment the able-bodied person from the family moves away to work in another place, in many cases, we found the first victim is the collection of the pension for the old age. I mean, the widow at home or the old age woman at home. That gets disrupted because most of these states don't have a doorstep, pension delivery mechanism. It's something as simple as that. For the community from which the migrant workers come, I think there are 2 things that community leaders, local government leaders have actually asked for. One is information. Something like a registry. Do they have information as to where the people are? How can they be contacted in terms of emergency? That's one. And the second and the most emerging thing that we found is this need that's emerging to use migration to stop migration. I mean, can we use the money that comes from migration to actually create local development? So we have community leaders who are actually asking migrant workers to invest in locally productive employment generating things like improving quality of life. So there are remote parts in Odisha where migrant workers are actually buying auto rickshaws and transport vehicles and putting them for service locally, because that improves quality of life for people who stay behind. And so there is a community need there. So I would think some of these key points in terms of interventions that can actually help, whether it is financial, whether it's occupational, whether it is social or emotional, or in terms of larger local economic development that would actually take advantage of the opportunistic migration that happens. Thank you.
That was a wide range of issues, and I don't think anybody in their right mind should even try to bring together all of this, and we need a lot of efforts. Nirali and I do think we have a few questions, but we have been getting the privilege of asking a lot of questions. So quickly, before our esteemed panelists leave, I think we will try and answer some of the questions that have been raised here. And I would request any of the panelists to take up the questions. Nirali, if I miss out, please do lead. But I don't think we have the time to read out each and every question. So I've been keeping a track. I'll quickly summarize. So Ananya had a question around the absence of international agreements to address the rights and protection of climate-induced migrants. So this is something I was wondering, because it's also when Ritu points out that, internally displaced person is agreed, but not cross-border migration. And coming from a background of forced migration studies, often there are still conventions about refugees, but climate refugees are not accepted or recognized, and that is a major thing. But also on the flip side, often internally displaced people are not recognized, especially in the case of slow onset disasters or slow onset changes. So that's one set of questions. There is another set of questions around how climate change is shaping geopolitical relations. I think I'm asking this question because I feel they are very closely related. Like when we talk about geopolitical relations shaped by climate, we cannot sort of ignore the issue of migration and labor force. And so those are two of the questions that I would first like to take up. And then there's a question about especially how climate change and climate change induced migration affects children, and especially like insecure forms of migration around children. So that would be some of the questions we can probably take for now, and then we again maybe take a second set of questions.
Whom you want to speak?
Maybe like all of the esteemed panelists, if you take like 2 to 3 minutes, 2 minutes maybe to respond to this, and then we can have another round of questions.
So maybe I'll start then. I think I have read all the questions to all the people anyway. I would reread that. I think I wanted to pick up the database question. I think the time has come for to look at some type of unutilized, unknown data. You should keep your eyes and ears open, because after COVID, I was talking to one of the students. He said he got the data of our mobilities. Today I'm in Trivandrum. I am in Kerala, but I'm in another city. People can move through my mobile. I have moved from Trivandrum. I am in Kottayam. So night I will be in Mumbai. So please remember that data being now used to study migration during COVID-19, that mobility. So I think similarly for climate change, maybe the water level for the long period and conversion of agricultural to non-agricultural reasons, because then it became a housing property. I think we should look at some type of, I call them, innovative and then sudden thinking. I think you cannot go and collect data immediately because Kerala floods or something like that. I think some type of thing, the young people sitting here, you always should look for a new way of getting the data which is already existing. For example, sale of the land. And also, for example, after the floods in Kerala, there are localities, the land is for sale, nobody wants to buy there. And the whole things are gone. Like that, there may be some locality, that how the land price is completely, and that will be another way to look at it, how people are moving from some belt to some belt. I think there are many ways you can look at the pricing, land price. I think those type of things we should put piece, and then add up, what we call them, like the Kerala story, or the climate story. I think you should think of a story, pick up from different angles and then add up. I think that is something I want to tell to my younger people who are sitting here. They should look for an innovative database. I'll stop there.
May I request Ritu to?
Yeah. Thank you so much. So, the questions are very interesting. And in fact, all those questions are quite interesting in the question like Q&A. And I would have loved to respond to many of them. But quickly, just on the what international, or whether it would really impact geopolitical issue. I'm right now based in London, and you would understand, that, as I said, there's a political economy, why they don't accept cross-border migration. Because when people try to cross Mexico border into the US, when people try to cross the English Channel and try to enter into Europe, they don't want to accept that it is because of climate change. Because it is the lack of action on the part of developed world that they haven't met their commitment on climate finance. They have not done enough to reduce emissions. Now, how do they go and face back their voters, especially the young voters who are really conscious about climate change? So there is a deliberate attempt to say that cross-border migration is not happening, or especially the people who are crossing English Channel in boats. They are definitely not because of climate change. And if you look at our region in itself, of course, Professor Rajan raised this issue of data. Like, do we really have the data? And we all know that there are migrants coming from Bangladesh. There are migrants coming from Nepal. So do we really know how much is that flow? Do we know, have we done that analysis that every time a cyclone or a flood hits, the Sundarban side of that side, people do come in. The border is so porous. So how have we seen, and if people are coming with illegal middlemen, where do they really land up? And I would say, like in Africa, at least, they have this ECOWAS where, the whole of Western African, of course, not all country adheres to those requirements, but at least they have agreed on portability of social protection across countries for the migrant workers. So at least there's a framework within which can be strengthened, which can be provided, like if there's climate finance, that climate finance can support the cross-border migrants. But we don't even have that in this region. So if people from Bangladesh is crossing over into India, and from here they are transported back into, transported further into Middle East, do we have an arrangement where, there is some sort of climate finance coming in to provide that additional social protection benefits to these, to the people who are coming from other countries? And we all know that, when we were doing this research in Kendrapada, there were a lot of Bangladeshi people, migrants settled there. We all know they are settled, but they operate within the, below the economic, they're still working as laborers and workers in different informal workspace. But because their rights, they are not legal, their rights are not upheld, and therefore they get exploited and work in modern slavery-like condition. So we do need recognition, we do need to acknowledge, we need to capture how much of that is actually happening, and then provide them coverage. And then international community should definitely, especially the developed countries, should definitely own up to its responsibility of providing that support to these migrant workers, because it's not India's problem, it's not Bangladesh's problem or Nepal's problem. It's been forced because of climate change. So how do we really provide that additional layer of support to these countries to manage this cross-border migration problem?
I'd just like to make one point in general reference to the questions that were there, and that is, see, it's clear that climate change is happening, and people are choosing to migrate as a coping mechanism. It's a way people have to continue to live. It's how societies have to continue to grow and flourish. Now, unfortunately, in many policy circles, there's a way to look at this kind of migration as something that is to be stopped. I mean, that is not desirable, which is not true, because, see, local economies cannot grow unless new injection of money comes in. I mean, it cannot just recirculate what is already available. And many of these parts, whether it is Sundarbans, whether it is Eastern Ghats, Odisha, Central India, outside money has to come substantially from migration, because government's contribution into new money into the local area is reducing. So it's not just about climate change and its effects, it's also about the rights of these locations to continue to be meaningful living places for people to live. And it's a fundamental right as a citizen of this country for me to be able to go and work anywhere I choose to work, whether it's in the Northeast or whether it's in the South. Now, we somehow seem to, both at the policy level and the legal framework levels, many of us in the social circles seem to look at this in a very negative manner. And I think that's something that we should try to address, and to the extent possible, accept that migration is a reasonable livelihood option that people can have, provided they are not forced into it and those elements of slavery and all are factored in. But this change needs to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, Dunali, do we take, or we have just I guess 1 minute. So instead of, instead of probably trying to take more questions, I understand that we have not really covered a lot of things because of paucity of time, but this was a very, very enlightening, insightful beginning, and I hope this was. And just by just trying to sort of recollect, and I don't know how good a student I'll be in trying to recollect all the varied points that were kind of discussed, but I think one of the major things that is coming up is also the need for data, need for more research and data around climate and climate change, because we still do not understand the human and social dimensions of it. Maybe a little more the environmental dimensions of it we understand, but not the human dimensions. Then the second set of points that comes to our mind probably is that how it requires a multi-pronged approach, both at this both at the source and the destination, and also with multiple stakeholders in sort of an integrated way, and also very contextualized way, that what is it's not, there is no one size fits all formula. Third set of things I believe is that we now sort of come to an understanding that yes, migration, I mean, there is efforts at sustainability, right? That we're trying to be able to stop at least climate change where the clock, where the clock is ticking. But migration has to be accepted as something that is going to increase, or that has always been a coping strategy, and how we make that migration secure has to be our points of view. Our major concern. And then sort of also migration is sort of a relationship between mobility and immobility. It's also people who move and people who stay, and how far are we be able to understand both of these aspects of migration together. How I think one of the issues that I would like to what comes to my mind is how we can use strengthen local governance to be able to address these issues. And finally, maybe the idea that, how migration and remittances can be the best used to be able to address the issues of sustainability. I'll stop here and I'll ask Nirali to add her thoughts to it.
Thank you so much, Ekta. I think, Ekta, you have summarized the discussion really well, and I take this moment to thank all the panelists. I'm so sorry Dr. Rajan already had to leave, but thank you so much, Libby, and thank you so much, Ritu, for joining us on this conversation, and to all our attendees for also asking a lot of questions that we could not take up. And we hope to continue this conversation. We hope to keep this going, and as we delve deeper into understanding more layers and more nuances that are associated with this phenomenon. And let's, as Dr. Rajan clearly said, we need more researchers and we need more data. Let's strive for that together. And I once again thank all the panelists. Over to you, Mayank.
Thank you, Libby. Thank you, Ritu. Thank you, Ekta and Nirali, for moderating this session. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
And a big thank you to Mayank, actually, for organizing and getting everything together in place. It was great. And thank you so much.